Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to all those attending today. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us for the next installment of the Hickey Virtual Learning Session, where today we'll be talking about the exciting new report the Hickey Global Institute released on U.S. credits and incentives, our fall 2020 report. I'm David Hickey. I'll be your MC and your host today. Excited for a robust conversation on our findings, other key insights and trends in the industry, and then also joined by one of my esteemed colleagues, and we'll have a makeshift panel and open it up for a Q&A. I'm going to start here on video. I'm actually going to turn the video off for now as we go through the presentation to be able to allow, if anything, for bandwidth purposes. But thank you again for joining us. We'll go through a few housekeeping items and then we'll hop right into it. So thank you again. So a few of those just quick items of housekeeping before we get going with the presentation. One thing you probably have noticed, you've been muted upon entry in working through Zoom as a attendee. We want to encourage this to be as engaging as possible, so please utilize the Zoom chat function at any point during the webinar session. And while we go through, we will be conducting polling as well during this presentation, so please stay engaged, participate as you can, and then we'll open up the floor for Q&A at the end of the webinar session, which will run through that Q&A section. This webinar session, as was probably notified when you logged in, is being recorded and will be available online. You'll be able to find that on our YouTube page, Hickey Associates, and I'll present that again in a little bit. So thank you again, and let's go ahead and get into it. Just a quick background on who we are at Hickey Associates. Founded in '86, we were one of the first companies to provide an integrated and deliver solution location strategy and incentives. And now, nearly 40 years later, we are one of the global leaders. And just a quick snapshot of who we are, what we do, and some of our key metrics of delivering solutions around the world. As a site selector, as this location consultant, incentive provider, there are a number of different areas that we come in and we support our clients and our partners around the world. And these are just a handful of those areas and what it means in being a site selector today. But really what we're going to focus on is on some of these elements here today. So economic development incentives, what is going on, what's out there, some of those complexes, we may call them incentives, incentive compliance and administration of those, and then also on the training grants and workforce development side. We won't go into robust as far as and how to pursue and approach the incentives, but certainly some of those key insights and trends as we go forward into this conversation. But most importantly, and why many of you logged on today, was for the launch of our latest legislative update. We call it the U.S. Credits and Incentives Update, our fall 2020 report. Exciting release. It's now available online. You can find it on our website. But overall, it covers updates from all 50 states, Washington, D.C., and Puerto Rico, looking at a number of different incentives. And what we call incentives are those incentives that are tied to economic development. We did talk about COVID-19. Of course, it's important to and not to leave that aside. But we'll talk a little bit about that here in just a few moments. But really, the report was to talk about all those other incentives, a lot of those traditional that have been developed and utilized to drive economic development and induce investment, induce job creation for communities. We'll talk a little bit about the federal overview, some of those programs that are out there, some of those that many of you on this call are very familiar with, but then also a few that you may not be as familiar with, and then some other key insights and trends as well. So as promised, we're going to try to make this engaging and this in place. And so our first polling question today is on how often in your world, and I know we have a lot of different types of attendees from throughout the industry and throughout the exciting process, and it is. Economic development is about partnerships, and it's about a number of different stakeholders, and in the most successful are coming together for a project and to make that project come to life, those new jobs, that creation, or in some cases, and where we are in many communities around the country and around the world today, to retain as well and to help protect and reserve that business and that revenue. So our first polling question, which is now live, that you'll see on your screen: how often is your company or your clients or your projects as an economic developer considering incentives in those business and real estate decisions? So is it 100% of the time? Every time you're entering a project, your client, you're an economic developer, every single time it comes through, incentives are considered, are on the table. I'm not saying that incentives is leading this decision, but is part of that process. Is it maybe 3 out of 4, half the time, 1 out of 4, or never? And we'll give it just maybe another 15 seconds as just getting used to the platform here, and then we'll share those results across the team. Thank you very much. Just another few more seconds. All right, well, very interesting. So show those results there. So 46%, nearly half of the attendees on that engaged and voted in this poll today, 100% of the time. And that's important, and as we advise our clients to do just the same. Every time incentives is not going to be on the table, and incentives shouldn't always be on the table or part of a leading in the consideration, but certainly in ways whenever making a significant business or real estate decision, looking at ways that you can partner. Incentives can come in many different shapes and forms. It's not just about financial support and aid, but also technical resources, recruitment support, workforce development support, things along those lines. And so it's good to see that much of the group is about a quarter, 75%, and another 20% on 50%. Interesting, 0 and the never. So certainly a group that understands what we're talking about and where we're in play. So we'll have another poll question in just a few minutes, but just to make sure that we are grounded and we're in the same place when it comes to incentives. So very rudimentary. We're not going to go and spend the rest of the time on incentives 101, but just make sure we know what we're talking about. We're on the same plane. So business economic incentives, resources, monies that are available to a business through a government entity, a stakeholder, a utility, other regional partners. And what they are meant to do is the communities will benefit, will drive, induce new jobs, capital investment into that local region, increase revenues, while businesses can benefit by reducing costs, discovering additional resources, technical assistance. And it's interesting and also to highlight that project confidence too, that ability to really showcase or to have, is that support going to be there? And that's where I really come back to also not just the overall of monies and coming in the doors, but just that confidence that perhaps, that my community, my partners are really ready to support. And I'm ready to make this investment coming from the client side and, being able to drive that. And perhaps maybe the project is going to come, but, maybe you get into a phase 2 or even a phase 3 commitment because of that support that's there with the economic development and other stakeholders. So going into that, when should a business consider incentives? Well, if you look at this closely, it basically says all the time. And we're not saying again, all the time incentives should be on the table or should be part of the direct major conversation. But it is important to understand that they can come in all different types of business cycle and throughout that process, whether it's a greenfield, it's a new startup, it's a growth expansion phase, but also even into that maturity phase, really being able to look at and understand, where is in a lease renewal situation is a major business decision, especially today in these times we're in now. But even in the closer use, certainly community partners, if for, having to vacate or dispose of a property, certainly working with the community partners and stakeholders to identify, what might be that best use or what are ways that can be co-invested into that property to provide a higher end and to provide, a value that many might be looking for or is best fit for the community. Following from that, we'll look at just some of those triggers that come into play. Is it a major capital investment? Is it human capital? Are we investing new hires at certain training programs? Even investing in the site and daycare facilities, health and wellness, things along those lines. Whenever looking at acquisition strategies, real estate, is certainly understanding how these programs can work, how they can work together for the business, for the community, and further. And then also energy efficiency, environmental, sustainability strategies. True, just as we say with workforce development and training, these can be true win-wins for the community and for the businesses as well. And one we've actually added to this as a trigger, and something we've certainly seen since the first quarter of this year, is that sudden shock element as well. Really when there is an emergency situation, a global pandemic, being able to leverage some of these programs, these support mechanisms to really help businesses as they go forward, and not just again about growth, but about retaining and surviving some of those most difficult times. And that, risks, disasters come in many different shapes and forms, and being able to help those crunches, those issues of liquidity and challenges, leveraging incentives to do so. And I know a lot of, when it comes to the COVID-19 relief, and many of our partners in economic development, friends and colleagues on this call right now, enacted a number of programs, a number of very exciting and very, very successful programs in supporting businesses. Many of those were targeted to Main Street, targeted to small businesses, and important. And for this session today, we're not going to spend as much time on those programs, but I'll refer to that more in a second. So now, an interesting poll and a question when we do this session, and when I do similar learning sessions and our partners and some of our colleagues, is what are some of those factors? And I'm going to give you a hint. There is no right answer to this. But which are the primary factors driving incentives? And choose what you think are the top three. I just launched the poll now. So, is it the location that is driving that decision and being in that geographical sect? Is it trying to get workforce and wages? Is it on the capital investment and trying to drive that into the community? Is it on tax liabilities, or is tax revenues that are in play, and trying to drive those and increase the tax revenue? And then R&D expenditures. Is it really trying to drive R&D, drive what do you see in whatever side of the industry and these partnerships that you come from and you participate in? Where do you see those being the top three? We'll give it another about 10 seconds here for voting. So thank you. It's great participation. Thank you. Let me close out the polling now. So we see the number one driver, in this poll, in this survey, is jobs. It's workforces, and it's important. We want to include wages in this because it's not as important. Jobs are jobs, and jobs are important, but also those wages and making sure that the jobs that are targeted to that community, to the industry, to the type and level, to looking to drive that long-term economic development. But really, so those top threes in it: workforce, wages, capital investment, that equipment, that construction, overall facility work, and then to that location itself. We'll talk about some of those programs, opportunity zones example, but driving into that geographic space and into the realm. And just to quickly share those results there for you as well. R&D expenditures, just a couple, but certainly a number of those programs as well. We'll talk about those in a few as we get into the legislative update. So thank you for participating. So so as far as those go, so as we talked about, so the location of where that investment is and trying to utilize and leverage incentives to drive that investment into the people themselves, creating the jobs, driving that capital investment into the community, the tax revenues into that, and then as well as that R&D expenditures. So as we review in the report, we're not going to spend an extensive amount of time. There is, of course, been the major significant and in the investment now of trillions from the federal government, which has been built out to be emergency relief and stimulus funding. The fourth round of stimulus, as we look at it, is still up for debate. Certainly, I haven't checked my Twitter feed in the past couple hours, so not sure where that is right now. Of course, tongue in cheek there. But as we've seen these three phases thus far, the first phase was really on that rapid preparedness, vaccine, healthcare. Into that second phase as well, increase in testing, some of that, particularly helping those that are frontline healthcare workers, increase some of the Medicaid funding back to the states, enhance unemployment insurance, and then the CARES Act, which is really the one that many are familiar with, and included what to many on this call and participating in this webinar today, certainly important, but along with the PPP program, there's the unemployment bonuses, employee retention credits, SBA loan financing, but also very important, the economic development funding initiatives that were part of that. And I know that many of you have leveraged these prior but even since as well. So $1.5 billion went to EDA, Economic Development Administration grants. It's going to be used for equipment, infrastructure, even site acquisition. $5 billion went into CDBG, the Community Development Block Grant Program. It's been used in a number of different ways, but capital improvements, training offsets are very often, then as well as another $1 billion that was put in lending authority for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, especially under that Rural Development Business and Industry Loan Guarantee Program. We've also seen in the significant funding that was released to go to the states and communities, and those being leveraged on the case of billions now, leveraged for COVID relief and put into play to help with that immediate response. And now we're also seeing much of those funds being utilized in ways of economic development, particularly targeting those businesses and individuals that are affected by COVID and are still being affected by COVID. And we'll talk actually a few of those examples in just a few moments that we cover in the report. But the COVID-19 response, the economic recovery incentives, we have done separate sessions alone on that. But I want to encourage all of you, if you can, open source our incentives.hickeyandssociates.com, which is a database open to the public on these economic recovery centers and around the world. There's a global catalog of these programs, and certainly encourage you all when you have an opportunity and to be able to track that. And if you have any updates, please, there's a source and a live chat feature on the site to support as well. When looking at the federal government and the overall is, of course, opportunity zones is still one of those hot topics, certainly in the economic development and incentive space, and also one of those that, is not without controversy, depending on different sides of the discussion and debate, looking at the success of it thus far. And we're not going to go into that debate today on this call, but what has been interesting from it, and those not familiar, it's a designated qualified zones. We're encouraging driving investment into those, and part of that investment, to support is a capital gains exclusionary occasion, depending on the time that you have that investment in the opportunity zone. A couple interesting things. One is the IRS is currently, Internal Revenue Service is currently reviewing some foreign investor rules, particularly on their capital gains reliefs and how that works from a foreign perspective, which will be interesting to see as that comes out and if that can help spur additional investment as well. And then also, one thing that we talk about and it is incredibly neat thus far is this enhanced opportunity zone, where we are seeing states and communities that are putting investment into these opportunities and driving them. And it makes a lot of sense as the governors, as the legislators, the lawmakers identified these zones ultimately true to the Treasury to determine and ultimately designate them. Why not add on these additional incentives? And in some ways, just like new markets tax credits, it isn't always, it can be challenged, it can be complex, and it doesn't always fit the project and to be able to utilize and leverage it, or perhaps even the time to do so. So we've seen, here's just three examples: state of Maryland, state of New Mexico, and the state of West Virginia, where they put in these programs and trying to drive investment, bespoke, either leveraging existing programs or even creating new ones to help drive that investment into it, whether it's an increased value in the state of Maryland for jobs within an opportunity zone, state of New Mexico, and leveraging the LIDO program and being able to drive additional discretionary funding with additional checks on that and performance measures. And then in West Virginia, where you could almost eliminate your state taxes over 10 years if you locate an eligible project in a qualified opportunity zone. So let's hop into the state updates. Some of the key trends and insights that we cover in the report, and some of these aren't new in the sense of where skill development is something that's certainly been around for a long time, but driving skills, and even before the pandemic, when we were in a full employment situation, it was very difficult to find work, to find the right employees. It still exists today. Certain industries, there's certainly more skill and talent available, but it's still going to be a challenge, especially for some of those very high demand skill sets in this space, and so some of those programs. So incentivizing film. So still driving film incentives, so a controversial incentive type out there, but tying in what we've seen in some states is really tying that back to economic development as well, and some of that funding and what that can bring to the communities. Some of the marquee projects, we'll mention some of those in the news, some of the compliance related to COVID, transparency measures, some inclusive policies. We'll talk about one in particular. Talk about how, as mentioned earlier, how some states and communities are leveraging the federal COVID relief. We'll talk about some of the major program debates that are out there, and then also just quickly on some of the PPE support. And again, want to encourage anyone, if you do have questions as we go through, please utilize the Q&A function on the screen. As you do so, you'll find it either on the top or on the bottom of your panel, depending on how you have accessed the Zoom session today. So just to quickly, and we're going to kind of run through a number of these, but on that skill development side. So Arizona is one of those. They created a program called the Rapid Employment Job Training Grant. This was a reimbursement grant that was directed for funding of businesses development, hiring employees between part of that initial heavy COVID stretch. So between March 1st and September 1st of this prior year. Very quickly, funding was dispersed. Applications are no longer being accepted for that program, but there is encouraging discussions to allocate supplemental funding. We also talked, just a quick note on Arizona, part of their GPLIT program, the government property lease excise tax, is certainly under some scrutiny and review, and just some good insights on that in the report. State of New Hampshire trying to attract that talent and drive especially the STEM talent pipeline into the state, was able to receive a recent 5-year grant from NIH, National Institutes of Health, part of it especially focusing on biotech. We were talking about earlier, some of the driving workforce and targeted individuals, and you will see that, and it'll be a theme through a number of these, but known as the New Hampshire Creates the Future. This is a grant supposed to work STEM education, and not with today's graduate students, but actually middle and high school students, with a particular focus too on those of the most diverse school districts across the Granite State as part of it. New York, Governor Cuomo recently announced a Build Back Better program, $9 million award across the states, the Empire State's Workforce Development Initiative. And this program is set to support job training for 3,600 New Yorkers across the state. And this is in addition to another $12 million that was recently announced, and is available now for businesses to start pursuing and to build consortiums to capture. Just also brief mention in New York, extended for 3 years several programs that were targeting sustainable business investments in lower Manhattan in New York City, and very interesting programs that they are, and the focus to bring back workers to that post 9/11, and still some of those programs as they've evolved over the years, nearly 20 years later. South Dakota recently initiated a program called the Upskill, which is actually online certificate programs to help in a number of different fields, especially those that are in high demand, such as tech, manufacturing, healthcare, among others. And the initiative, as it's set and funded, is to really be little to no cost for the participants, and it'll be delivered, much of it online, through the state's technical colleges, and I'll list it today. And then just one other, just quickly to mention, the Back to Work Rhode Island initiative, leveraging CARES Act funding. Governor Romano has released $45 million to go, and it is to this program. It's to target training opportunities for individuals that are in Rhode Island residents to work directly with employer partners that have been pre-identified and worked through, and it is meant to be free for those. Bank of America, Salesforce are among two of the early major companies to participate in this process. On the film side, so I know many of you, may not be in this side of the industry, but more and more, particularly on the economic development side, are getting involved, because the benefit and the economic development side of it, the overall economic impact of film productions can be so significant. As states like Louisiana and Georgia, and now in California is another, and some of the success. Now, one of the recent ones that we've seen is in the state of Montana. Given a lot of credit to their program, the Montana Economic Development Industry Advancement Act, to 20% rebate on eligible expenditures, and they have seen and been able to tout directly to it a number of major productions that have We relocated part or all of their production to Montana, including Yellowstone, featuring Kevin Costner, which is a very popular series, has moved primary filming to the state of Montana. There's also a major media hub that is under development at Missoula Airport, which will be about a $20 million investment. And part of that drive is setting back this incentive program as well as daily direct flights to Los Angeles. California, one has had as part of their film incentive program, and this now they're calling it Program 3.0, where there are some additional changes to it, some more transparency, some additional performance measures, some new policies and harassment policies specifically to the program, as well as to a more low budget element. However, there are some significant programs and productions. One of those Netflix production called Gray Man, which is going to be featuring Ryan Gosling and Chris Evans, reportedly is going to have an economic impact of at least $100 million just for the below-line wages and other qualifying expenditures in the Golden State. Colorado is one of those states that, while some success has been seen and proven to it, there's actually some reduced fundings as overall budget challenges in place in Colorado. That debate is raging on right now as far as the efficacy of the film incentives. And then in Puerto Rico, Direct Sport, as part of their film and industry development program, nearly $150 million in film productions alone to the island territory. And for that program, but a 40% tax credit for spending on local spend. Additional bonuses can be in place for non-resident expenditures and other measures. According to certain reports, this incentive alone and these productions are projected to create approximately 3,000 jobs for Puerto Rico. Well, many of these are projects that you will know well and have certainly been out in the media and been major stories, and not just in our industry media, but across the board, front page and many mainstream sources. One of those, probably above all of them in this previous year, has been the Tesla Cybertruck factory. The search overall from Mr. Elon Musk ended up focusing in on Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Austin, Texas, with ultimately the project and the factory going to the Austin area. Travis County provided approximately $14 million in tax breaks for that, which could increase, tied to performance, if the company exceeds their investment targets of $1.1 billion. And then the local school district also approved approximately $46 million in abatements for that over the next 10 years. And that factory is expected to commit to nearly 5,000 jobs as part of it. North Carolina, program that may not have been on all of your radar, but is certainly a hole in one. The United States Golf Association, the USGA, was searching for a second headquarters outside of New Jersey, and ultimately looked at the Pinehurst area in North Carolina. And one of those programs looking to leverage was a site infrastructure development grant program. Had some limitations to it. Particularly, it required 100 new jobs, an investment of $100 million, and be a manufacturing company. So the governor, along with state lawmakers, were able to create a fix and actually establish a new eligibility category called sports championship employers, and set some investment and hiring requirements to be able to ultimately capture and secure that program. Virginia, so in the Commonwealth, Amazon HQ2, and certainly one that we talked about on a previous Ledge Update webinar and discussion, chose ultimately to invest in Arlington and create, definitely be 25,000 jobs, maybe even more. As in making those investments and meeting commitments and some of the, especially some of the construction and capital investment mandate as part of that agreement, unfortunately, haven't actually, Amazon, been able to capture all of the incentives thus far. And part of that is from Arlington County. And the reason for it is because those incentives are tied to it's tied to their transit occupancy tax. And since COVID has come on, there's certainly been, less hotel night stays, and the cost of the hotel night has gone down, and thus reducing what the overall tax level would be in those revenues. And so while there has been actually an increase in revenues, it is not meeting those incremental targets that were required to pay out that would be $23 million in incentives to Amazon. So, not to say that, the project's not going to continue forward and moving forward, but it's an interesting tie to, where that incentive came in and into some of those measures of performance, but not even necessarily performance tied to the project itself or to the company, but overall to the to the revenues and how it was developed out and developed in a attempt to be in a sustainable and responsible way to the taxpayers. Wyoming, one project that many of you may not be aware of, and economic development is certainly about the art of creative partnerships to drive successful outcomes. Recent partnership in Cody, Wyoming is one that many may not have foreseen or forecasted. Since he first arrived on the scene in Northwest Wyoming, the famed rapper, fashion designer, and overall entrepreneur, Kanye West, started making an immediate impact. In fact, some would call him a real estate mogul as he began investing in some properties, including his own home, but as well as some in the city. But soon after, looking at ways that he could develop his Yeezy brand, which is an influential fashion brand and especially known for their shoe line, and as part of a recent partnership with Gap to provide a much more economically reasonable price point for his shoes, actually entered into a partnership with local economic development officials for a former warehouse owned by Cody Laboratories. And actually the warehouse now and facility was built in essence in use of a state grant and funding and now owned by Ford Cody. And over this time, what was initially built to be a pharmaceutical campus, the Yeezy brand and Kanye West has been able to drive more investments. And in fact, now as investing in the facility and fit out and lease agreement is now to make this into a prototype manufacturing center for this shoe brand, and could employ approximately 200 people within the first couple of years of operations, and is certainly expected to hire locally to fill many of those roles. And it's certainly interesting. You never know who those partners might be, but certainly in the end, it is about those partners and stakeholders. Now, I know there are a number when we come into compliance and COVID and many of these, and we've probably these through our blog and through some of our incentive alerts, but for this particular, just a couple of these were two of the first. So one of those in New Jersey. There's been great debate over Grow New Jersey program and some of the call them the marquee incentives of the Garden State. But this really is a focus on the compliance side. And one of those requirements as part of the program, and as well as the economic redevelopment and growth program, both that and Grow New Jersey are now expired. But for those that had active agreements, it required a certain percentage of individuals, employees that were under the commitment would have to physically be in place to capture those incentives and to be in compliance. Well, quickly, NGEDA, the Economic Development Authority for the state, was able to reduce or modify some of those rules, at least for the interim, to help with companies in realizing that even by state rule, state mandate, especially at that time in March and April, employees weren't even allowed to come to the office, and so being able to comply. And so loosening some of those regulations to meet the current situation on the ground, and we'll still be tracking that as we go forward, as well as what the Assembly and Governor Murphy's office can work with some of these expired programs. In the state of Michigan, in a similar manner, recognizing this impact, these changes, these economic forecasts that couldn't have been predicted or planned for companies that are receiving incentives under the Michigan Strategic Fund and impacted by COVID-19, they can apply under this awardee relief initiative on a case-by-case discretionary basis, but it may be temporary relief. It could include payment deferments, milestone exemptions, refinance requests, extensions of execution deadlines for the agreement, and even resizing of project scopes, course, project award as well. Certainly, if as we're working with our clients on multiple projects there with this program, certainly if you are, and if you're anywhere else in the U.S. and you're having a challenge, meeting some of those compliance requirements due to COVID, definitely, look, there may be an option already on the table, or certainly from our economic development partners, they're trying to work through to find a solution and to get into it. The next on transparency. So transparency, I do another virtual learning session where we talk about how this has changed and how transparency and return on investment has changed over the years. And really that increasing level of it. It is fascinating to see. It's great to see across the board. And just a couple of these and examples here over the past few months. Mississippi, down in the state of Mississippi, they approved what's known as the Incentives Transparency for a Prosperous Mississippi Act, as it is known and referred to. And really if now capturing incentive in the Magnolia State, there's certainly things to be aware of in going into it. Some you may not have had to before is enter into an MOU with the state that purely outlines what the performance measures are and bespoke to that project itself. And then if a business doesn't meet those, there are new performance measures in place that requires, which could actually create a prohibition on capturing incentives for a certain amount of time. And also a new annual report, which would be required to be filed by March 1st of each year. Ohio, which has done a great job when it comes to transparency and reporting. In an annual state report I just released, and there's just some interesting data points on overall maintaining compliance. And while, the overall, looking back at 2018, it's a report from the Attorney General's Office of Ohio, 65.1% of businesses were in compliance in 2018. There's actually a slightly downward trend from previous years. In 2017, the rate was at 78.3%. And in the previous year, in 2016, nearly 85% of businesses under their programs were in compliance in that particular year. Altogether, the report reviewed about 150 and 149 awards, valued at a total of $64 million in state incentives. So interesting to see where that goes, and particularly in 2020, as many of our clients and partners have certainly faced significant challenges across due to the COVID pandemic. I want to encourage everyone again, just as the Q&A function, to be able to ask any questions as you may have. We'll open it up for a second. So inclusive policies. So there are a number of these across the country, and many of these that have sparked in debate over in recent months. But Indiana is one of those, actually more particular in Indianapolis, where they are looking for more reforms to create a more inclusive, so-called economic development strategy, to make sure that as the different incentives are leveraged at the local level, especially property tax abatements, that the evaluation metrics for those aren't just based on the economic impact, but also based on the community impact. And looking at it, so, are the jobs meeting wage levels and wage minimums that are in place? Do they provide healthcare benefits? Are they hiring locals as well? It also now requires, and they're looking at some of these as well, to an awarded company, property tax, it must invest at least 5% of the estimated tax earnings into workforce support programs. And that could include training, but it could also include transit funding, child care funding as well, among other measures. And ultimately now, abatements are reviewed on a discretionary basis, values based on the increased assessments levels over up to a 10-year basis, but as well as some of these new evaluative. We just mentioned this program here in Indianapolis, but there are certainly a number of others that are doing the same and looking at it across the board for their businesses, their communities across they can. Mentioned earlier, there are a number of opportunities, and really across the country, states, communities, lawmakers, governors are looking, mayors are trying to figure out, with some of this COVID relief funding that was received as part of the CARES Act and to be leveraged into other programs, the Main Street program, other treasury accounts, how could those be best utilized to support businesses, to support individuals to get their feedback on the ground? A few of those examples, one of those in Idaho, where defunding overall, actually $100 million set aside to offset unemployment benefit program. Actually, employers in Idaho capture up to $1,500 for returning employees to the workforce that were unemployed. Another $200 million in the GEM state was leveraged to provide property tax relief. There's actually direct funds to cover payroll and public health and safety personnel and some of those challenges. And then in the state of Iowa, in order to do that, in Idaho, had to ultimately deliver 15 to 20% of savings for businesses of residents. In Iowa, leveraging that funding, $50 million of it to go to broadband and to the Empower Rural Iowa Broadband Grant Program, which is actually a tenfold increase in investment from the previous year, and that key of infrastructure to economic development and driving that going forward. And in Hawaii, leveraging funds, $10 million in this effort as part of a training, and really to support displaced workers, and is utilized so there are a number of emerging industries, as well as targeting those that are displaced in sectors under the Aloha Plus Challenge, which is a statewide initiative to meet sustainability goals. And then also just wanted to quickly note on a few, and many of these are still in active and in a live state right now. And so don't want to go into too far, but interesting to be on the radar for everyone in this discussion today. Nebraska is one of those had expiring tax programs, Nebraska Advantage Act, and kind of a mix after a significant debate. The unicameral legislature and the governor Ricketts approved a few different bills and key pieces out of it. One of those are income tax credits, property tax credit relief for Cornhusker residents, and then also some other reforms and renews of business tax incentives, and more of that in place in the report through it on the state of Maryland. Actually, there were some legislation called the End the Ineffective Business Subsidies Act of 2020, which would have abolished several of the major state incentive programs, but that ultimately did not move forward. It did receive a public hearing, but did not move forward in the state's General Assembly. In Florida, while many have moved, nearly 1,000 Americans are reportedly moving there daily, seeking lower taxes, sunnier days, and the Florida life. And while getting stronger, there's actually one less program on the books right now for economic developers known as the Qualified Target Industry Program, which is it creates tax refunds for businesses creating new jobs, and especially in targeted industries. Tennessee, serious budget challenge ahead of them. The Nashville Council on the local level, facing a number of fiscal measures. There was actually a provision under debate there to create a full flat 1-year ban on economic development incentives in the city. It was an extensive debate. Ultimately, the resolution was voted down 20-14. Overall, in Tennessee, a number of the state programs are under scrutiny and compliance issues, such as things as the Fast Track program. And then Alabama, it's a couple programs under facing expiration today, including the Alabama Jobs Act, which is set to expire at the end of the year. And then two more just quick updates and just of interest and driving through and still will certainly be relevant going forward, but on the PPE side and support for those in the state of Georgia, we saw a new job tax credit that was introduced and proven law for $1,250 per job for eligible PPE makers, and that could be over the next 5 years. And in South Carolina, which was one of the first, if not the first, local community to embrace the need for PPE, this spring, the Lancaster County Council approved some new incentives as part of it. Eligible businesses could capture a full abatement of all property taxes for 10 years, even if they receive donated land and some fast track permitting. If they invested in developing and manufacturing PPE equipment, and there were some definite performance measures tied to that, and as well as restrictions on what that PPE, not just turn on the sanitizer, but some of that equipment and healthcare life-saving devices that were very hard to capture, especially at the height of the pandemic and uncertainty earlier this year. So those are the quick updates across the report and covering a number of those around the U.S. and not exhaustive, as there are a number of others, and certainly encourage everyone to join it. I am now going to and download the report online. I'm not going to open it up. We have about 10, 12 minutes remaining in our time here. And I'm going to open up, and one of my esteemed colleagues, Mike Nolan, is going to join me here. I'm going to bring him on and promote him as a panelist. And we're going to open it up for some questions here as well. And we received several questions in advance of the presentation as well. So thank you again for those that did present those. And I'm going to actually bring down the presentation for a second. And please, if you do have any other questions, use that Q&A feature. But thank you again for those that sent over those some earlier. But one of those questions as we came through, and just quick to address, will the presentation be available online? Yes, it will. Essentially, we'll have it on our YouTube channel soon after the presentation is complete. Here today, we'll also send it out to you that attended as well. And thank you again for doing so, but we'll have that available online. One of those interesting, and I know we have a lot of different folks and members of our audience today attending that are carry different sides of the industry. But you, and Mike Nolan, and receiving a true introduction, is one of the leading, one of the leading site selectors and industry experts in the U.S. And prior to joining, Hickey & Associates was one of the top industrial real estate brokers in the country, and focused often, and as many of you that work in the industrial space know, many times they are complex projects, and that is certainly where Mike's specialization lies in the space. So, so for those, and a number of our members that are on the call here, so putting on that real estate broker hat, how would you advise the real estate leaders in the audience of how they should advise their clients when it comes to incentives and looking at incentives going forward?
It starts with the education process. So a lot of the slides that you popped up early on, the trigger events, really understanding what are the opportunities to help your clients go after those incentive programs that might be out there. Oftentimes people look at incentives for that big relocation, a consolidation project, maybe a massive expansion, but really understanding that there are other opportunities, capital investments, training opportunities. You hear your clients buying a new piece of equipment. Those are all things that you can help your clients with. And then taking it one step further, it's if you're in the local market, it's meeting with the EDOs and understanding what are those zones in your area, whether it's a TIF or an enterprise zone, really getting the basics of understanding the new market tax credits, and helping your clients realize that, hey, there could be other financing sources. There could be ways the EDOs could help with personal property tax abatements, especially when those investments could be borderline. So just really educating yourself and understanding, asking the question of why are you making this investment? It'll help you really dive deeper in with the company and maybe even start to get into projects outside of your local market. And if you're a multi-market broker, it's a no-brainer to really start to understand what those trigger events are and what the opportunities to offset either that investment, that lease renewal that's coming up, the new building purchase, the expansion, and the federal programs that are there as well. So I think it starts with education and knowing your market and getting close with the EDOs in your local area.
Very good. Thank you, Mike. And I assume that goes to our development partners as well, correct? To understand what are those tools that are in place that they could work together with the partners and all the different stakeholders that are involved, to help get a project off the ground or find that right tenant, that right occupier as well. And obviously communities have a major interest in what those development projects are, and certainly utilizing many of these tools and resources that are available, and several of those that we mentioned on this call today to be able to do so. So thank you. So, and I can take on this question. So with an increased focus on transparency with incentives, how do you advise clients when evaluating opportunities? So that's a great question. And transparency, return on investment when it comes to incentives is certainly something that is going to continue, going to expand. There is a level where, you know, it creates challenges and actually hamper potential investments as businesses. There is always proprietary, there's IP, there's confidentiality challenges in place, but there is a middle ground out for that to make sure that the taxpayer can be sure their return on investment, and while the company can still, you know, protect those business interests, and as well as, you know, some of that personal identifiable information in some of those realms. So as we work with our clients, we always share, many of you, you know us well and work with me personally on some of these NDAs and getting those non-disclosure agreements in place, which are absolutely vital for a number of different reasons, particularly that confidentiality. But being able to work through that, and then, you know, as well as using the word transparency, being transparent through the process of what might be required as well. What are some of those commitments, and not just on our performance side, but commitments of what the company may have to share and put in place. And we'll work with our clients so that they understand that, what might be required for them. And maybe there's a certain report or a data point that the community may ask for, a county on a payroll report that would be a challenge to produce just under their corporate standards and mandates. You know, we can maybe work another way to devise that or get that in report in place. So that's a great question, and certainly something we encourage, you know, but certainly something that we can manage and work together on going forward. Another question, I think this question came in, probably good for you, Mike. If evaluating a real estate portfolio for future capital investment, how do you advise clients as they try to navigate where to put that investment? So just adding on to that question, it's a great question. Put their equipment, upgrade facilities, the construction, you know, as we talk about, and many of our clients are global in their operations and the way they look at the world. And even in some of this, in this COVID era and beyond, looking at it strategically on a global supply chain and global production, but of course, all the way down to the local level. But I'll turn that over to you, Mike.
Going to sound a little bit like a broken record, but I believe management teams need to educate themselves, and especially when you're looking at a multi-market portfolio, you may have an assumption in your head that this manufacturing line is going to go here because we have room or capacity. If you're looking at your portfolio, you need to understand where can you shift capacity within that network, where you find the right labor pools. You need to look at it from the fact that certain states may be more beneficial. States can help with that personal property tax, as I mentioned, the abatements if you're going to need to expand a facility. Being able to tap into some of those federal funds that may be there that the EDOs and the municipalities can help apply for, whether it's at CDBG grant, there's all sorts of other opportunities out there. And then also understanding the zones that your particular manufacturing distribution facilities are in. And aside from just, I'm stuck on manufacturing, but this works for tech businesses and office as well. If you understand that you have a location that's sitting in a new market tax credit zone and you can get ahead of yourself and you're creating jobs, you're investing money into the community, there's some great financing programs that you could end up getting 20-25% of that loan forgiven. And at the same time, you're in a wonderful census tract from the perspective of the federal government has created, whether it's the opportunity zone or new market tax credit zones. Those are census tracts that need help. So those local communities are going to be there to support you. So it really comes down to, once again, understanding those trigger events, what's available to your company, and then being able to evaluate it between 4 or 5 facilities, because one location, you may be able to offset that capital expenditure by 40-50% versus putting it in one location where the area doesn't warrant that type of assistance from the EDO or state or county.
Great, thank you, Mike. It's phenomenal. So we've one. I think we have time for one more question and one more that's come in. So, question on retention incentives and are they available? So absolutely, and we encourage. So incentives are certainly a critical tool for communities to drive job creation and new capital investment, and they should continue to do so. And as they're mandated, and as incentives should be leveraged as tools and resources that best fit that state, best fits that community, and what the goals and aims are of the taxpayers and the community gain altogether. But in these challenging times, we need to find ways to support all existing businesses as well, and that aftercare, that investor side. And so being able to do that and leveraging programs. Now, not all programs are written or in statutory terms can be used in that manner, but certainly trying to take us to the box. We've worked with several of you on this call to help some of our clients and with their existing businesses to help with that retention, help retain those jobs there, help retain that investment, and ultimately those tax revenues too, to make sure, in that highest value, because it has been a challenging time. It's going to be a challenging time still going forward in this uncertainty. And so any way that we can support and drive the businesses. And again, that's not necessarily a financial, tax incentive or cash grant out, but might be in other ways, such as training, workforce development, incumbent employee support for training and things along those lines. So thank you, Mike. Appreciate you joining us. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Stay safe and healthy. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
And now I'm going to open it back up. Just quickly share final couple slides here before we close out. Just want to encourage everyone, again, the report is now available online. Thank you for taking the time today to join us, and you'll find that we have several other reports to find on Off-Thought Leadership available on our website as well. Here are just 3 others. Recent reports that we've done on incentives. And these are all outside the U.S. focus. So one on the EMEA region, very unique, very different than the U.S. approach in India, and then as well as larger in the Asia Pacific region. And then certainly want to encourage everyone to join the conversation online. We have some pretty robust debates and discussions, as well as interesting topics to come on. You can find us on several different channels, including Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, and even on Instagram. So I want to thank everyone again for taking the time in your busy schedule to join us for today's virtual learning session with Hickey, where we covered the U.S. and credits and incentives 2020 fall report. And as well as thank you, Mike Nolan, for joining us as well on that brief expert panel. So I want to thank everyone again. This will be available on our YouTube channel. We'll also send out a thank you to all registrants and attendees. So with that, everyone, please stay safe, stay healthy, and hopefully we'll see you all again soon.